There Might Be Hope, Chapter 7, Dead Zones. Snid, Latin, nettle, singing plant. A third of the living creatures in the sea died. Revelation 8:9. On a cornflower blue canvas, a yellow, single-engine crop duster with a blue horizontal stripe running from propeller to tail ends its pass over young tidy green rows and begins its steep ascent and tight turn to make another pass. The pilot carefully scans the land below him to avoid accidentally spraying houses, school buses, or passing cars with pesticide. Across the country, an immense bright green tractor rolls slowly and steadily along, gently pulling a liquid fertilizer sprayer behind it. In the past 2 decades, sprayer technology has become incredibly precise. The flow rate, intensity, spray pattern, and angle can all be easily and accurately adjusted, oftentimes from a cab-mounted iPad. Operators can rapidly scroll through farm software-generated spreadsheets, graphs, and maps depicting massive amounts of current and prior field and crop data. At our fingertips lie troves of data the field workers of Leftis Magna couldn't even imagine. Yet despite all of our impressive technological advances in precision farming, between 15 to 60% of what we spray won't be absorbed into the plant. Some of what we spray, dust, or dress on a field will land on plants and ultimately become part of our food chain. How much the plant absorbs depends on many factors, including sunlight, heat, humidity, and the plant's life stage. Some of what we spray or apply will land on the soil and persist there for decades, perhaps even centuries. However, around 60% of the nitrogen fertilizers applied and between 15 to 40% of pesticides will either evaporate into the atmosphere or run off into waterways and ultimately our oceans. Not far from the skeleton tower, whose single strobing light alerts cargo ships to the Mississippi River's southwest pass, they float, effortlessly according to the rhythm of the currents. Draped below them are delicate folds of one of nature's most elegant fabrics. Jellyfish are one of the only living creatures here. Species that rely on oxygen in the water, such as their natural predators, can't survive in this hushed and barren void. Eastern Hemisphere's largest dead zone. The size of the dead zone south of the mouth of the Mississippi River varies annually, but it's usually between 2,000 to 8,000 square miles. Never a grand tourist destination like the beaches of the Florida Panhandle, it has historically been a sportsman's paradise, supplying seafood for those tourist destinations. Many of our oceanic dead zones death certificates bear the same cause of death as that of our soil microbiomes. Both were fed to death with synthetic inorganic nitrogen. As the applications of synthetic and organic nitrogen fertilizers have grown, so have the number of oceanic dead zones. In 1960, there were 10 documented oceanic dead zones around the globe. By 2006, there were 169. Today, there are over 400. Dead zones, or some level of oceanic eutrophication, are found near almost every continent today, including Antarctica. Globally, close to 200 million tons of synthetic and organic nitrogen fertilizers are applied each year. If 60% of this is washed downstream or evaporates into the atmosphere, then close to 120 million tons of synthetic and organic nitrogen is entering our waterways and skies every year and has been for decades. Meanwhile, American CAFOs will produce around 133 million tons of manure each year. Most of it will also be wasted and either run off into waterways or evaporate into the atmosphere. This bioaccumulative cocktail of partner pesticides, the IV drip nitrogen, was sold to the American people as the remedy to feed a burgeoning global population. But it has virtually eliminated the fish, shrimp, and oysters that once were a primary source of food and significant source of income for the Gulf Coast. This synthetic and organic nitrogen not only promotes rapid growth in farm crops, it also causes rapid growth in micro-ocean plant life. Just as with farm soils, this growth of algae and plankton causes them to grow to a population density that the ocean carbon to nitrogen ratio cannot support. This exploding population also rapidly consumes all the available oxygen around them and kills oxygen-dependent crustaceans, fish, and turtles. As these animals decompose, further ammonia and death gases are released into the ocean and then the atmosphere. Marine mammals left swimming in an ocean of death gases either die themselves or flee. Finally, the algae themselves die, leaving only the jellyfish behind, gracefully dancing amid the death. For decades, a false nitrogen cycle was erroneously believed and taught to multiple generations that plants preferred consuming inorganic nitrogen to organic nitrogen. But like ocean algae or phytoplankton, high levels of inorganic nitrogen cause soil micropopulations to rapidly increase to a point. The microbial growth stops when all of the soil's stored carbon deposits have been devoured, and we're left with a dead zone rather than a soil microbiome. And this is where we've been growing our crops for the past 80 years, a soil dead zone. Because our plants prefer complex soil proteins and amino acids to an inorganic nitrogen IV drip, much of the inorganic nitrogen we apply to our fields isn't absorbed by the plants either. So it evaporates or washes downstream. Around 120 million metric tons of inorganic nitrogen goes into the atmosphere and the water in and around our planet each year. Synthetic inorganic nitrogen is created under high temperatures and intense pressures by combining hydrogen and atmospheric nitrogen to produce ammonia. Initially, the heat and pressure came from coal. Today, about 20% of inorganic nitrogen production still relies on coal. About 80% of the production is underwritten by natural gas. Inorganic nitrogen production consumes about 3 to 5% of all natural gas production globally. Making just 1 ton of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer requires 33,500 cubic feet of natural gas. The process to create synthetic inorganic fertilizer also creates more carbon dioxide than any other process in the world. In 2010, synthetic inorganic fertilizer production created around 450 million tons of carbon dioxide. Much of the production is actually beneficial to the oil and gas industry because it often puts stranded gas or gas located in parts of the world without economical markets to use. Turning the gas into easily transportable, though still highly volatile synthetic and organic nitrogen fertilizers has long been considered a win-win for both the oil and gas, and agricultural industries. Creating synthetic and organic nitrogen also requires substantial amounts of water. Ironically, excess water is perhaps the primary reason why its primary competitor, cattle manure, is rarely used as fertilizer, even though it is organic and preferred by the soil. Cattle manure's high water content makes it too expensive to ship. Not to mention, most cattle manure is tainted with an amalgam of harmful bacteria, pesticides, and antibiotics. Thus, millions of tons of both inorganic and cattle nitrogen find their way into our waterways and oceans every year. 78% of our atmosphere is naturally comprised a form of inorganic nitrogen. It serves to naturally protect the Earth's atmosphere, but the excess nitrogen that evaporates from our farm fields is in a different form. It doesn't protect us, and it can't simply return to where it came from. What happens to it is largely unknown. While carbon dioxide is the focus of most atmospheric discussion, it is the nitrogen cycle that has been altered more than any other basic element cycle. For nearly a century, we have drenched our fields and soils in synthetic and organic nitrogen and pesticides. After having been applied, these chemicals once diffused across the environment. Today, these diffusions are bioaccumulating and becoming increasingly concentrated on the global stage. When the problem washed down the creek and into the river, it was diluted to the point that we felt safe to swim, kayak, and fish in it. When it washed down the river and into the ocean, it was diluted once more, and we felt fine to fish, swim, soak, and let our babies play in it. The problem was out of sight and out of mind. Because we didn't have a solution, we were going to ignore the problem. That's becoming and will continue to become an increasingly difficult thing to do. Big skies and vast grassy plains join up with distant, verdant, pine-covered mountains. A shallow, rocky river lazily winds its way across the vista. Scrappy little horses restlessly graze in herds across the valley. Smoke rises from a white, circular yurt, while joyous children play outside. The Mongolian people aren't tillers of the soil. They have maintained their nomadic lifestyle for millennia. Doubtless they never dreamed that their peaceful valleys would be softly and quietly laden with pesticides. But they are. The LRAT is short for long-range atmospheric transport. Up to 20% of all synthetic and organic nitrogen and 40% of pesticides applied to crops don't wash down waterways. They evaporate into the atmosphere. Although the spread of pesticides and synthetic and organic nitrogen across the atmosphere isn't talked about much, Chinese scientists are now studying how pesticides are picked up into the atmosphere and then deposited elsewhere, oftentimes far, far away from the farm fields. Wearing a mask can't block the feeling of eating dirt. Chinese Weibo user. For China, the problem may be more immediately apparent than in America. Sandstorms have been plaguing the country for years, and they seem to be growing in intensity and frequency. Nicknamed the China Dust Express, these sandstorms don't only affect China. The Neighborhood Watch of Japan, North Korea, and South Korea have all voiced their complaints. While the eastern U.S. and the Caribbean occasionally receives a dusting of Saharan sands or enjoy a red hazy sunset, California, western Canada, and western Mexico likewise enjoy free golden skies, compliments of China. The skies aren't just filled with migrant sand, though. Intermingled with them are synthetic and organic nitrogen and several families of sides. Once pesticides have lofted up into the atmosphere, there are two ways for them to return to Earth. One is through dry deposition, where chemicals simply fall back to Earth. The other is through wet deposition. This is when pesticides fall back to the Earth in rain, fog, or snow. Whether pesticides or inorganic nitrogen, these chemicals are seldom carried away on the winds for a one-time trip to make a new forever home somewhere else. They are typically jet setters. They might travel 20 miles down the road from the farm field where they first were supposed to go to work to alight on a schoolyard playground. From the playground, they might be lofted up again and carried higher and further across the continent. This cycle may continue indefinitely until they are either absorbed by a plant or consumed or inhaled by an animal or human. Atmospheric currents don't respect international boundaries. They go where they like, and they like to travel. They've been translocating pesticides and fertilizers globally since we've been applying them. As early as 1969, 3 out of 5 snow samples from Antarctica tested positive for DDT. Some of the halogen based pesticides found traveling the world have been doing so for close to 100 years now. Ice samples from Antarctica to Svalbard, Norway, contain halogen based pesticides. Water, soil, and air samples from the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas do as well. When happy, carefree hikers deeply inhale fresh mountain air or refill their water bottles from pristine mountain streams, they are likely inhaling and drinking in agricultural pesticides. Pristine environments don't exist anymore, and neither do pristine farmlands. More recently developed pesticides aren't any better at staying down home on the farm. Glyphosate may break down into aminomethylphosphonic acid, or AMPA, a slightly less toxic version, or it may not. Researchers have found it persisting in the soil up to 10 months after being applied. 10 months wasn't the amount of time it took for the glyphosate to disintegrate. It's just when the researchers ended their study. While AMPA tends to be more of a homebody, glyphosate is happy to see the world. Few studies measuring glyphosate in the atmosphere are available. It takes courage to ask these uncomfortable questions, but living in ignorance isn't helping anyone. For those brave enough to do the research consistently confirms that glyphosate bioaccumulation is increasing in the air we breathe. A 2014 study in northeastern Brazil found 100% of air samples in both rural and urban areas contained glyphosate. A 2018 study in sparsely populated Argentina found halogen-based pesticides and glyphosate in more than 80% of the rain samples taken. Their local soils were determined not to be the source of these pesticides. A 2011 study found between 60 to 100% of air and rain samples from Iowa, Mississippi, and Indiana contained glyphosate. It's out there in significant levels. It is out there consistently. Paul Capel, United States Geological Service. The Hauts-de-France region that stretches from Paris to Calais is a surreal blend of tourist perfection for the upwardly mobile. Charming villages dotted with chateaus and fairy tale castles are interspersed with miles upon miles of family hiking and biking trails through Eden-like forests, pastures, and orchards. Michelin-starred, locally sourced artisan and farm-to-table restaurants abound. It's also the home of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. On a clear day, from the sheer grassy cliffs of its coastlines, you can see the white cliffs of Dover. You might never suspect that in 2004, 14% of 59 air samples taken in this region detected glyphosate in the air at breathing level. That was almost 20 years ago, and glyphosate usage hasn't slowed down since. Like the tourists that frequent the area, the glyphosate in the study didn't appear to originate at nearby farms. It seemed to have drifted in from elsewhere. Glyphosate generally becomes airborne when mixed with dust particles and returns to the earth after heavy rainfalls. Unlike a conscientious crop dusting pilot, rain falls wherever it pleases, including over homes, playgrounds, and hospitals. One of the greater scientific unknowns is how all of these transgenes, nitrogen, and pesticides interact with each other as an environmental cocktail. Little to no research has been done on such interactions and their long-term ramifications. Global dimming is the measured decrease in the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. The strength of the sun likely hasn't changed over the years, but the amount of sunlight that is able to reach and warm our soils has varied substantially. Global dimming occurs when large amounts of tiny airborne particulate gather in clouds, thus blocking the sun and reflecting sunlight back into space. Are some of the inorganic nitrogen and pesticides now filling our skies contributing to global dimming? Quite possibly. It might sound like a cure for global warming, but it isn't healthy for our soil microbiome. It also slows down new topsoil creation. The bacterial to fungal ratio of healthy soil microbiomes is a reflection, among other factors, of the amount of sunlight and heat the soil receives. Decreased sunlight and decreased heat slows down soil microbial metabolism, energy consumption, and reproduction. These are what drive the creation of new topsoil. Consequently, less sunlight means slower soil production. When you're already losing soil at an unreplenishable rate, slowing down new soil creation doesn't seem helpful. That's the end of Chapter 7. Thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to be automatically updated when the next chapter is available. If you'd like more in-depth information about these topics, I'm going to be going over my notes and some of the research I did on my Patreon site, and you're welcome to join me there. I hope you will. Thank you again. Bye.